Welcome to part 4 of the rock sculpting tutorial. In this part we'll be sculpting details and damage for both the rocks and the ground. But first we will need to import all the parts that we exported from Maya. I could just use the import button, but if you have multiple files, it's easier to use the multi-append plugin that you can find under Subtool Master in Setup Plugins. When using this plugin, I can import all the files at once, and they get imported directly into the same subtool. If I were to use the normal import button, I would have to import each part individually, and after that I would have to append each part into the same subtool manually. Now that I've gotten the base into ZBrush, I will start to dynamesh each group. I use Dynamesh because I want to connect all the rocks in each group and to get rid of unnecessary geometry that isn't visible. This will also reduce the poly count a lot depending on your settings, but as long as I keep the settings fairly high, I don't think I will lose any visible details on the modular rocks. Before using Dynamesh on the ground, I will subdivide it a couple of times to get a smooth surface, which is closer to what I want it to look like. Subdividing or not have no effect on the poly count you'll have after using Dynamesh. Dynamesh only looks at the size and volume of the mesh, not the poly count. So let's start sculpting. At first I'll try to stick to bigger size changes and then work my way down. Currently I'm filling in areas with the Trim Smooth border brush to create a mix of flatter, cleaner areas and more detailed, deeper areas. It's also to help minimize the duplicated look. No matter how much you rotate and scale the modular rock, there will always be duplicates near each other that looks the same. So by filling in some areas and adding details to some parts, I can avoid that without spending too much time. Let's fast forward a bit. I'm now taking a break from the rocks and moving to the ground. I might end up working on parts that won't be seen because of the ground, so it's better for me to finish the rough shape of the ground first before doing anything more to the rocks. I want to try and add some life to the ground by pushing the ground onto the rocks, making it look like sand that has been pushed up by the wind. For the ground, I will mostly be using the Move brush and the Clay Tubes brush. I'm using the Clay Tubes brush with a round smooth alpha for basic sculpting, and the Move brush to push the ground up onto the rocks. As it's mostly repetition from now on, let's do a short time lapse then skip ahead. So I've done quite a big jump now. I ended up doing quite a few changes to the ground. For example, I went back on that sand dune idea, as it didn't really work well with the height alpha I plan to use for the ground later on. In the next step, I will start to add detail and damage with the alpha brushes that I showed in part 2. I still haven't touched most of the other rock parts, but I plan to use this middle part as a template for the rest of the parts to see what works or not. So let's go back to the middle rock. To start, I will create a new layer and store the morph target, like I did in part 2 of this tutorial. And I can use it like this together with a morph brush. You can go back to part 2 for a more detailed explanation. First I'll be using the rock wall brush to place some damage detail. Then I'll revert some of it back with the morph brush to hopefully create some interesting damage. This usually ends up with a lot of back and forth work, as I tend to revert back too much of the damage. Now I'll try out the rock trim brushes. I want to try all of the brushes, since it's my first time using them in a project. But I might revert back most of these changes, since I want to keep the middle area quite clean. I will mostly stick to using the rock wall brush for this middle part and focus on the edges. Looking back, I might have kept some of that middle damage, as it felt a bit flat. And although the damage details are quite well defined here in ZBrush, they are actually quite subtle and shallow. The matte cap material that I'm currently using highlights the edges and darkens the deep areas a lot, so you get a bit tricked by this. It might be better to work with a more neutral material while you are sculpting, to avoid such issues. Using the rock wall brush together with the morph brush is also a good way to add crack-like damage. Instead of using a custom alpha crack brush, this method gives you more freedom, as you can create any type or size of crack or damage. I also switched to the trim smooth border brush a lot, while adding detail with alpha brushes. It's a good way to add variation to the details on top of using the morph brush. It's also good for creating angles. Here I'm using the orb cracks brush to split the rock. It's a good brush to use when you want to make clean straight splits. I often use the orb cracks brush to split and create patterns. Then later I come back with the trim smooth border brush to define the shape. As it's mostly repetition from now on, let's do a short time lapse then skip ahead. For a final layer of detail, I'm gonna use the grunge brush. is a good way to add micro detail with minimal effort. At this point, you might be happy with the detail and damage you have added with the rock wall brush. In that case, you could bake the current layer and store a new morph target. By doing this, you could add detail over your past edits with the rock wall brush, and the morph brush would only affect the newly added details. Another, maybe quicker way to add details to a certain spot is to mask out the areas you want to add detail to. To mask something, hold the Ctrl key and paint on top of your mesh. If you want to erase parts of the mask, hold the Ctrl plus Alt keys. The black area is the area that won't get affected. So usually I mask something out, then I press Ctrl I. That inverts the mask. So what you masked out is now editable and the rest won't be affected. I will start to move over to the other parts now and repeat the steps I did for the middle rock. The middle rock might look a bit unfinished, and I would probably agree, but it comes to a point where you have to move on. I could keep at it for days on this part alone, but it's better that I get the other parts to a similar level of detail. Once I do, I might do a test render and see how it looks. If I feel it needs more work after that, I can always go back and do more, if I have the time. As I mostly will be repeating the steps that I did for the middle rock, I will speed the footage up a bit and skip when needed. And if I happen to do anything new or interesting, I would try to comment on it. As you can see, I'm basically using the same techniques that I used on the middle rock. There is no real need for me to make it more advanced than this, as I'm getting the results that I want. Sculpting techniques like these are hard to teach with just a tutorial. So once you finish watching, I suggest you go try out all the things I've been talking about yourself. Even if we use the same tools and techniques, we have different tastes and ideas, so no need to copy me exactly what I'm doing. I have now brought all the parts to a similar level of damage and detail, and I'm now returning to the ground. For this part, I will mainly be using the lava crust brush. I will use it inverted to create a sort of rock mountain kind of look. But I will also try to use it uninverted for some parts to get more variation. To invert the brush, you can hold the Alt key while drawing. For a more detailed explanation, you can go back and watch part 2 of this tutorial. I will try to drag the alpha out in different sizes, as well as rotate them differently, so I get as much of a natural look as possible. Later, I will also use other brushes to help increase variation. Using an alpha like this can also help create ground detail that interacts with the rocks and pushes the ground on top of it. Later I'll be adding different materials to the rocks and ground, so parts of the ground that intersects with the rock will stand out a lot if left untouched. Next I'll be using the rock brush to add small piles of rocks to the ground. I'm mainly gonna add them around and next to the bigger rocks to make it look like they've fallen off the damaged parts of the rock formation. For these, I will also try to rotate and use different sizes to make it look more natural. You could also use the morph target technique to erase specific rocks for more spread and variation. As the rocks are not connected, it's very easy to do. Might be worth the extra time, since the rocks do stand out quite a bit. I'm now at the point where I feel I can call this good enough. By no means perfect, there is always more you can do, but at this point I feel I would just spend a lot of time on details or spend a lot of time rotating around the viewport searching for problems. Usually problems become very obvious when you let some time pass, but for this project I need to continue working. But I'll be adding a short review of the sculpt at the end of this part that I recorded after some time had passed. But before we do that, I'll prepare the sculpt to bring back into Maya for rendering. To do that, I will use the Decimation Master plugin to optimize and decrease the poly count of all the parts. Let's start with the ground. Locate the Decimation Master plugin under Setup Plugins, then Decimation Master. Then pre-process the ground. This might take some time, but when it's done you are free to switch between poly counts without loading times, which is great. Since I will be rendering in Maya, I'm gonna choose a poly count that won't slow down the viewport too much. Even if you reduce the poly count by 95%, you won't see much difference. Before using the Decimation Master plugin on the rocks, I will merge all the rocks. Then I will do the same thing that I did for the ground. I'm keeping the ground and rocks separate because I want to create separate IDs for the rocks and the ground, so I can more easily mask between them during the post-processing. So now we just have to export out the parts. So I added this part to critique my own sculpt. So hopefully you can learn from my mistakes and do better than me. It's easy to get blinded when working on something without resting your eyes. Something you don't always have the luxury of doing in production. So let's point out some areas that could most easily be improved on. The thing that stands out the most to me is this staircase kind of effect we have going on here in the middle. There is similar spacing and length to these rocks and the spaces between them. The rock in the middle also seems overly under detail for its size, and these straight lines here are making it very obvious. I should probably have built it using multiple smaller sized modular rocks instead of a single big sized one. These two middle rocks are also very similar looking, adding to the effect. So if I were to do changes now, I would try to make one of them smaller and thinner, maybe not connecting to the other side at all, something like this. The rock down here in the right corner also feels like it lacks detail, especially since it's probably the rock closest to the camera, so it stands out extra much. This top rock feels a bit disconnected from the rest of the rock formation. It would probably have been a good idea to have it connect in some way, but I'm not really sure. Might be able to improve on that during post. Last thing I'm gonna mention is that I would probably add longer and deeper cracks to this part. It feels like that would make it look a lot better. But as said before, I'm going to move on without doing any bigger changes to the current sculpt. There is always an opportunity to enhance or hide flaws during the rendering process or in post. Especially during post-processing, I'll be doing quite a bit, since this is just gonna be a one-shot render. I also want to mention that the finished sculpt will be available for free, together with the brushes and module rock. You can find the link in the video description. So that's it for this part. In the next part I'll be rendering in Maya using Arnold. Hope to see you there.